Pacific Trash Vortex. Disabled Eco-Wisdom versus the High-Speed Death Cult. An essay written and read by me, Mish Green. I've been trying to write this poem. 5 years for a wool sock, 400 for a coffee pod, where I list how long it will take roughly for a variety of different objects to biodegrade from sunlight and weathering, the state changes that they'll move through as they slowly break down into their constituent parts with help from the generous close attention of fungi, bacteria, and other microbes. And like the list of biodegrading objects, this poem falls apart after a while into a mess of uneven pieces. It's not clear what they are. 6-pack rings around turtle shells, glitter on everything. And it's not clear what this poem is meant to be. First the images fray, and then with them goes time, twisting at the edge of what is recognizable. Time degrades with each line. Between 2 to 4 weeks for complete decay of a paper towel, and 31,307 for monofilament fishing line. And as you can hear, this poem is leaning heavily to one side. Like maybe by describing each article of trash, I can make a map of some kind, a timeline that will enable navigation from heap to heap. Of course, I have a particular audience in mind, just one initially, the disability support assessor. It goes like this: me on a plastic chair, which is 500 years give or take depending on sun exposure, trying to convince her to see what she can't, what she won't. Tin can on a blameless average day, let's call it a better day. Aluminum, worse. Here's where the temporarily abled normies stand, and over there's the rest of us, the part marked by sea monsters and dragons. I start this poem with what I call chronic time, as in chronically ill, and then comes an apple core, a cigarette butt, a rift-cut piece of pressure-treated wood. I know something about decomposition, about being broken into parts by the world in which I live, like many disabled people. And for the purpose of this essay, when I say disabled, what I mean is someone who is facing significant barriers in their daily life and in society because of conditions that they may have had from birth, they may have acquired, or chronic illnesses, or mental illnesses, and some people would also include neurodivergence in the definition because it can have disabling results in a society that caters almost exclusively to neurotypical people. So, like many disabled people, I've got intimate knowledge of what it takes to unwrite yourself, to go from recognizable to not, seen to unseen. How sometimes time can be a long, long time, which is why I write this essay in chunks and asides, slips of time and stuttered thoughts. Gaps. A deeply disabled approach to thinking and creating that pushes against the streamlined and the smooth. And this is something that I have long been trying and failing to express, not just poetically, but to the state, as demanded at regular intervals. And the question then becomes, how do you prove the existence of the invisible? Even more, how do you prove it to someone who's heavily invested in denying its existence? The assessor is silent as she completes the next page with summaries of sketches, of Polaroids, of things I've let fall from my grip. And I panic. Talk of floating mass. I've got this fantasy that I will finish the poem. The Pacific Trash Vortex, I tell her, is almost invisible. And it will be undeniable, solid in its truth. Broken down into fine, tiny pieces, you'd sail your boat right through it. The assessor will read it, and she will shake off the stiffly bureaucratic ableist shroud that she's worn over years. And she will lift her head from the clipboard and she will see with clear eyes. Because in my fantasy, the poem is just that damn acute. Despite over 1 in 4 Britons having some kind of disability or disabling chronic illness, as a culture we still treat disability as something unusual and rare, like that one guy you know from your first job who uses a wheelchair, or the epileptic girl in your class at school. Centuries of economic and social othering, most recently in the form of the neoliberal paradigm in which we have lived since the 80s at least, have created this perception that there are actually very few truly disabled people. There's Paralympians, and then there's the rest of us. The rest of us who are skiving, malingering, faking it, failing to be inspirational and plucky, and by the rest of us, I mean all of us. Because no one is spared the reductionist logic of the binary. Good, bad, true, false, productively employed or passively dependent, well or sick. There's no accounting for the detail and the nuance in which all of us live, and there's certainly no accounting for the heavy loads that we carry if we are disabled by chronic illness, lack of access, and a world that insists on worth as economically defined. Disability is made invisible even when it's visibly present, because that's what our particular flavor of economic and social ideology requires. But despite this erasure, disability is common, really, really common. The UK government's long-standing approach to disabled people is one that is both punitive and paternalistic. It starts with disbelief and blame, especially if the illness or disability is invisible to the naked and non-disabled eye. And from there, it moves through degrees of surveillance and control, eventually forming a carceral twin to the prison system in seeking to contain and subdue unruly, unproductive bodies and minds. Invisibility covers an enormous swath of conditions, from asthma to OCD to Crohn's disease and on and on and on. And we humans like to privilege what we see, even when we know that eyewitness accounts are unreliable to the point of being false. So what does the space shared by invisible illness in both humans and planet Earth look like between individual and environment? And how do we respond as a culture and as a society? I don't mean this metaphorically, but physically, measurably. Climate chaos gains pace each year now. Growing deserts, fanning wildfires, killing and displacing millions of humans and billions of more than human lives. And climate disasters place disabled people specifically at 4 times greater risk of death in natural disasters across the globe, whether that is due to the increase of severe storms that interrupt the just-in-time supply chains that keep things like insulin available to diabetics, or in the failure of evacuation plans to include those with disabilities. Another example, antipsychotic medications impair the body's ability to thermoregulate, and so, on an increasingly hot planet, the most common treatment tool for the invisible illness, that is psychosis, puts that person at much higher risk of heat stroke and other heat-related injuries than someone who's not taking that medication. Global warming heats the planet, and disabled and chronically ill people are among the most vulnerable to the effects of that across the globe and across all communities. Our most recent widespread example, COVID-19 strategy, almost universally places disabled people as sacrificial lambs on the altar of abled society. Our deaths, our injury, and our isolation deemed necessary to enable the continuation of business as usual. Disabled activists refer to the COVID-19 pandemic as a mass disabling event, while the rest of society declares it over, and we choke on more grief. When disability is made invisible in an individualistic society, the result is a chasm that swallows those of us who live closest to the harm. So this means that disabled people who are also made invisible or disposable by things like structural racism or sexism or transphobia, poverty, classism, these are the people most at risk being swallowed by the kinds of climate chaos that we simply can't outrun. While the super wealthy build their bunkers in New Zealand or wherever else their money allows them to hide, or elected officials push through legislation that firmly supports maximum fossil fuel extraction and use, the remains of ancient sea life drives our planet closer to catastrophe. Money for oil, money for gas, money for coal and roadside air particulates for heating oceans and melting glaciers. Money for so-called invisible damage. Shift in the Gulf Stream. Microplastics in clouds, the growing abyss. Plywood when the meds kick in, and cigarette butt as they wear off. And I come again to that question. How do you prove the existence of the invisible? Even more, how do you prove it to those who are heavily invested in denying its existence? 1 to 5 years, like the sock. Money determines that banning single-use plastic straws will be an easy win with the general public because the general public doesn't require plastic straws that often, and so they do it. And too bad for you if you have tremors because of cerebral palsy and a metal straw will cut your mouth. Here's a paper one, and drink fast because that straw is going to be completely dissolved in 10 minutes from now. Time stumbles against your lip. The poem that I'm trying to write is partly about the way that time moves within a particular disabled and chronic illness neurology, something that I've come to think about as chronic time, or as Alison Kafer calls it, crip time. And by crip time, she means the unique ways that time can move differently around and through disabled and or chronically ill bodies. Not just in terms of us maybe needing more time to go from X to Y to Q, or to move slower than the abled world expects, but also in terms of patterning and stretch. Disability can bend time, pause and knot it, cause it to stutter and yawn, spool out longer than you might ever have thought possible. Here is pain looping time. Here is fatigue stretching it thin and persistent. Here is the delicately wound knot of time between the onset of dissociation and later the setting back into flesh and bone. We lean on our assistive devices, the tools that we learned in therapy and from one another. See 5 things, hear 4 things, touch 3, smell 2, taste. You are this many years old. I'm on the second stanza of the poem, and already I'm reaching to explain disability to anyone who's not yet experienced it. Already I'm at odds with language as I try and describe something that, while not being unique to disabled and sick experience, is the hallmark of so many of our body minds as we exist in this world. We speak in it, we move in it. I take the poem to my writers group and they tell me that I'm trying to write too much in one poem, that it deserves more room to breathe. And I wonder what that looks like. Breathing. If you're swimming and you get tired too far from land, roll onto your back. That's what we teach kids, even babies now. Rest there as long as you need. Floating on your back and breathing under a relentless sun. Drift through the Pacific garbage patch or trash island or the Pacific Trash Vortex, as it is known. Big enough to count as a continent by now. The unseen terror. Breathe. In trying to write this poem, I have had to admit that I'm obsessed with garbage. Tips and skips and recycling centers, incinerators, compost heaps, and all the other ways that we dispose of what we no longer want. The leftovers, the scraps, broken bits and worn. A friend tells me that he's similarly obsessed, and so we hatch plans for a zine. We tell each other to dig out all of our previous writing and art fodder that features any of these topics or locations, and I find a lot. I find chocolate bar wrappers and crisp packets that I stuck to my bedroom walls. I find the pill bottle mobile that I hung over my chest of drawers. The hundreds of photographs I took of bales of plastic sheeting and wrapping and bags, which between 20 to 500 years, depending on thickness. Semi-opaque, blue lashed tight to pink and green, red and white butcher stripes, and yards of that faint milky white that's made when translucent plastic is bundled into meter-square bales like the opposite of hay. And why am I still trying to write this poem? Because I want to understand why we can't see what we won't see. Because I know that the assessor is sailing past right now, and it is here, lapping at her hull. If only she would tear her eyes from the horizon and dip her arm into the sea. Instead, I'm on this page and in your ear, reaching for a metaphor about decomposition and the Pacific Trash Vortex, swallowing a little more salt water every time I stretch for it. Julia Watts-Belser says, "Here is one thing I know. The tendency to imagine invisibility as a property of certain bodies risks reinforcing a culture of compulsory ability, in which the obligation to disclose lies with the person who fails to inhabit a normative body-mind. Those who are invisible must again perform the labor of making their presence known. Or, as I think of it, coming out and coming out and coming out, because that is the only way we as a culture know how to see those at the margins." She continues, "Because disabled people's experience is not integrated into the culture, most people know little or nothing about how to live with long-term or life-threatening illness, how to live with limitation, uncertainty, pain, nausea, and other symptoms when doctors can't make them go away. Disabled, chronic, and sick writers, by contrast, often articulate a relationship to time and place that is rooted in the complex present, a recognition that satisfaction and pleasure can be found amidst rather than beyond the realities of limits and loss and uncertainty. As we collectively face an increasingly urgent climate present and future, I want to propose that it is disabled and chronically ill people, particularly disabled and chronically ill people who also live at the overlap of multiple margins, more likely to be poor, homeless or housing insecure, racialized, queer, trans, immigrant, incarcerated. This is who is ideally suited to conceiving of futures that are livable for all of us, because so many of us have been practicing this stuff for years and years and years already, of necessity. Adaptation is not a new conceptual project for those who have long been forced to hack our own disabled responses to environments that make us sicker. Disabled and sick people know that our neighborhood, our environment, our planet is suffering because it has been telling us clearly and in unambiguous terms for years, writing its ecological pain onto our bodies. In asthma and recurring bronchitis, in misophonia and the nausea-inducing vibrations that travel from the truck up to the 9th floor above, in long COVID, and in the debilitating reactive stress that haunts those who've had to carry displacement and hunger and precarity and loss and injury and grief following yet another of the once-in-a-century events that are the hallmark of our increasingly sick ecosystem. Disabled people are often really experienced with holding multiple contradictions out of necessity. We are geniuses at retrofitting because so often the assistive devices and the technologies and the environments that we need are simply not there, either because we can't afford them or they don't exist. Disabled people have long been supporting one another with this, building coalition in formal and more often informal ways across experience lines, doing things like setting up equipment and aid libraries that provide things like glucose monitors and crutches to those who need them, or organizing communication webs and resource sharing, or sending out support packs to those newly disabled in our communities, and theorizing and practicing disabled futures that truly center an ethos of justice for those who are most pushed to the edges by those futures, like gene editing and designer babies that wish us out of existence. Mia Mingus's concept of access intimacy and Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasina and Tuki Martin's articulation of care linguistics and care fluency all point to the fact that the understanding of care needs is a language. And like most languages, it's a living, evolving thing that can and must be learned continually by all of us if we're going to have a livable future. And none of these are mystical skills that a person either has or doesn't have, or that are bequeathed to you upon diagnosis or impairment. None of these things are fixed in time or in a single location. My body, your body, our homes. If our task as a species is to make truly livable futures, and it seems uncontroversial to me to say that this is the task in front of us all, then an essential first step is that we read the damage and the illness that our environments are carrying, that we listen carefully to what they're telling us about what we can't see, the air, the water, the soil, the very things that support life, the more than human population of living beings. Slow down. Observe, reorient, and then respond to the damage and illness with a willingness to learn complex care languages and the communication of the invisible. Indigenous land and water protectors have been reading the damage for decades, as have climate scientists and activists, all desperately trying to get and hold our collective attention with the messages that they are receiving. And yet, our society keeps speeding towards disaster and calling it progress. The breathless pace of contemporary life is bad for all of us, both disabled and temporarily abled, because it's designed to meet the needs of commerce, the exponentially large labyrinth of abstract accounting that we've allowed to dictate the shape of our societies and our global relationships with one another and with our home planet. Global finance moves at a speed that is incompatible with sustained and sustainable life. When I say that we need to slow down in order to see what we are doing, to hear the invisible, to know it, this is what I mean. In the most literal terms, we need to stop, allow our surroundings to unblur and come into view. And who is better placed to inform this change of pace than those of us who are already having to engage creative care skills every single day, who stand alongside the land protectors and the scientists and the slow farmers in hearing the earth speak to us and understanding that we are collectively and often individually moving at a self-destructive pace. Who better than those of us who are already living largely outside of capital and so-called productivity, and therefore outside of the high-speed death train that is industrial global financial progress. So many of us who are invisibly and visibly disabled are inherently anti-capitalist in how we exist because we don't serve capitalism's productivity imperative either fully or at all. So, what is our radical knowledge as exhausted people, as people in pain? And what do we wish others would understand? What can we teach or model? What if we, all of us, disabled and temporarily abled alike, accept that we can't go back, accept that we're here now and that we have to adapt and listen and learn from what our environments are telling us. We need to learn the skills of pacing in every aspect of our lives as a culture and society to understand that rest is essential. We need to listen to those who know that constant growth is cancer. And if this essay sounds like a simple statement in favor of the destruction of the capitalistic paradigm, that is because I'm already living partly outside of it. One foot in, and the other foot and my walking stick and knee brace out. Standing in the land where we have no choice but to find meaning that doesn't grow from how much or how fast we can produce and achieve, that instead measures success in moments of connection and collective care and rest. Standing in the land that recognizes the dead end of individualism. In their book, Care Work, Piepsna Samarasina refers to being part of that wild pack of slowness. And I want to ask, are you part of the wild pack of slowness? Have you seen it or moved with it? My wild pack of slowness moves on metal legs and rubber tires and crutches and sticks and sit down here in the text for a rest on that wall there. And look at that ladybird. It touches noses with the other one, gets one of its wings out for a clean. 20 minutes have now passed. My wild pack howls in pain when no one's within earshot, but sometimes not. Sometimes someone's there and someone hears it, and even more than the anger, the self-conscious hot face, the grief, the fucking grief, in that howl there is defiance. Used to always hold it in, no matter what. Used to stay in because of it, but now my wild pack of slowness is bold in our wholeness. And so we bring the burning skin, the gut punch cramps, staccato neuralgia, and the bass drum that beats down dry and deep in our bones. We bring pain out to the shop. A walk round the park if we can, wearing the biggest coat we have, and lippy as armor, and also because it can be applied in one simple slash. My wild pack of slowness knows how to hold love over distance, how to build intimacy between bedbound lives, and my wild pack also knows that we owe niceness to no one. Kindness, yes. Compassion, yes, we practice these until our insides are raw with trying. But the kind of nice that drifts bland above the skin without ever making contact, that causes no bother, expects nothing, we owe that to no one. And neither do you. My wild pack argues and shouts spiky words, finds each other so goddamn annoying some days because my wild pack is as multifaceted as yours, as diverse and many-mouthed, complementary and dissonant, as fractious and as solid, my wild pack. We crackle with flaws, like you. But membership in this wild pack entails a learning that we are one of many. And as one of many, we know that we are tiny, built of chaos, and yet still here, whole and real. And so are you. I'm writing this while waiting on surgery and definitive testing for what gets called a cancer scare, like a narrow miss while changing lanes on the motorway, or not. The unruly self. As I wait, I'm holding a mess of emotions in my body-mind, although honestly, mostly in my body, because my body speaks first in times like these, of fear, of gratitude, of numbness, of anger, of others that I still don't have the names for. In order to cope, I am focusing on both hope and denial, but I also know that I need to hold the possibility of diagnosis. The assessor pauses and holds her pen above the clipboard, so I go on. Along with the unreal feeling of disembodiment as I wait for an answer, I'm aware of the tools beside me, the hard-won skills that I've sharpened in decades of disability and chronic illness. How to live with uncertainty, how to live with mortality, with madness, how to live with what the world likes to call failure, slowness, invisibility, going from seen to unseen. Everyone talks like it's a moving island of nappies and plastic bottles, oceanic land of the dead, but it's not. It's quieter, far more sinister. And I'm aware of the unexpected connection to wider systems of life that difficult transitions can build. The ladybird that's currently hibernating in my office window near the fern. Water that's moving in great clouds across the sky. The mites that live on my eyelashes. We are connected. Not because disability makes magical savants of those that it visits, opening up some kind of mystical door through which we can finally know the depth of things, but for a way more pedestrian reason, because so many of us who live with disability and illness in this ableist society have long since had to shed the dangerous delusion of individualism and the luxury of believing that we can simply power through any fundamental challenges that we face, using our willpower or our material insulation or both. It's a soup of minute particles, vast and many and shifting. We've had to look our mortality square in the face, to stare deep into the eyes of vulnerability and inhabit it without applause. And we've built toolkits out of insomniac nights and shards of anxiety, out of debilitating exhaustion and the thin end of hope after such long, long illness. We've learned things, remembered. And one handful of seawater is like nothing to the naked eye. We've figured out how to live lives that the temporarily abled blithely call unlivable. Like water from your kitchen tap. And this is what I want you to know about pain. Ecological pain, physical pain, relational, emotional. This is what I want you to know about disabled strategy and the kind of things that we are all going to need to know, that we need to know now if we're going to understand and respond to the profound illness in our ecosystems. The essential knowledge, the strategy and the strength that the so-called weakest of us are holding. Fragmented fishing line, shredded net. To paraphrase Joanna Hedva, chronic illness and disability, with its blood, its shit, its agony, vomit, pus, and death, is metal as fuck. The assessor presses her pen on the paper and she looks up directly and firm at the dark rack of living seaweed draped along the length of my face.